On this episode of Pipeline Things, we get a very familiar guest. The Dirt Merchant returns to us to talk about his IPCE. I'm sorry, not his IPCC publication, someone else's IPCC publication.
You got to give him credit for pulling a solid and representing.
He did. He reps the topic of LiDAR change and differencing in elevation models. It's a great episode. If you are or aren't familiar with LiDAR and the use of it, repeat LiDAR, I'd recommend you give it a listen. And thanks to the Dirt Merchant for repping the paper he didn't author. Boom! All right. Welcome to today's episode of Pipeline Things. I am your host, Rhett Dodson, my co-host, Christopher DeLeon, and we are, again, here to talk about IPCE and the publications that went on in 2022. But before we do that, brief personal catch-up. Chris, how's life, man? Have you seen the latest Marvel movie?
I've not seen the latest Marvel movie. I know I'm going to make a confession. I don't know if the movie that you're talking about is really my cup of tea. I feel like the first one was cool. And then just like...
I thought we were going to see it together.
Yeah, I haven't seen the last one. But like the first one was kind of surprising. The first one was surprising.
Audience, we're talking about Deadpool and Wolverine, and I'm actually a little in shock that Chris hasn't seen them.
Look, here's my thing is like any of you who actually watched it, and if you watch the Marvel movies, if you saw the first Deadpool, you were surprised. You were like, this is a funny, good movie.
Yeah.
And then I just felt this in the second movie, I felt like, Like,
okay.
And then I talked to friends and they were like, it's a lot like the second movie all over again. So I'm kind of like, I don't know.
I thought we were going to see it together.
It reminds me of kind of Guardians of the Galaxy 1 versus the one with Ego.
See it after this. I thought that was the plan.
Well, we'll see.
Oh, well. Okay.
But yeah.
Next topic.
Yeah. It's summer.
Man, it is. It's crazy hot outside.
Yeah.
Right. Survived Hurricane Beryl, which is good. I was on vacation when it came through. So.
You know, it's... house cleanup is always interesting, right? So Beryl, for those of you that know, created a lot of havoc in Houston, and some people got it pretty bad if you lived around trees. So trees was like the thing for our neighborhood. We live in a place that has forest in its name. We have a ton of trees.
Yeah.
There's houses everywhere. So we've spent a lot of time cleaning up our house, making sure it's back to normal, replacing 80 feet of fence. Like it's this whole effort, right? And normally when people walk by my house, they're surprised because my fence is up and there's a bunch of debris because a lot of people are still just recovering. So I'll see a lot of the walkers walk and they'll just kind of stop in front of my yard and just kind of look around like, oh, look at these guys, you know? And so it's really interesting when people just decide to walk up and start judging your house after a storm.
Yeah, my biggest problem is when I got back, I couldn't run the robot mower. For like it's like a week, man, because I had to pick up all the trash in the front yard, and the robot mower doesn't do well. Can't go over like big sticks and stuff like that. So
yeah, I was gonna say, one of our buddies said this. You know what the ultimate flex was the week after Beryl was having a whole home generator and having your robot keep your lawn clean. That is Rhett.
It is true. I am very proud of my lawnmower. In fact, my brother-in-law.
So, I want to say this. So, if none of you have experience looking at someone's lawn that is maintained by one of these robots, it is incredible. Huh. So, I will say that. So, it probably doesn't take care of like trimming very well, like the edges, like an edger would. But it draws out these perfect lines.
Amazing lines.
And because it does it week after week or day after day, it builds up. And so these lines are phenomenal. So I went to Rhett's house and I'm seeing this thing and it's sitting there running around his yard. And I'm like, you know what? The only thing I could think of is the movie Dune. So I was like, I had some fun with it. If you guys haven't seen it, check our LinkedIn post. But it's fun. But dude, for real, your lawn is incredible.
You know what else is great? It was actually... While I was gone, my brother-in-law stopped at the house. Okay. And
he turned it over on purpose. He flipped it upside down like a turtle.
He was looking at it, working out front, and a neighbor came and approached him and thought it was me. Started asking about the lawnmower, complimenting my yard, right? And
please tell me he just went with it. Please tell me he just went with it. He's like,
he did not take credit for it. He did not take credit for the lawn. He told the neighbor that I would be back, and then my neighbor could ask me all about the robot lawnmower and what brand and type and stuff like that. So,
haven't you ever seen? So my oldest daughter loves watching influencers, and they're like click the link
I
below.
thought about becoming
click,
a robot mower influencer, man.
Yeah,
I'm
you could
close.
you could set a deal with them.
If D2 doesn't work out, that's where
we
I'm
get the
going.
link, put it in the podcast, and anybody
Yes.
that buys one, you get a little kickback.
Absolutely, 100%.
Anyways,
I don't know if our guest today is an expert on robot lawnmowers, but we can ask him. I do know he's not native to the Houston area. I do know that.
I wonder how
So-
he fared with it.
Well, I guess we have to bring him on.
Let's bring him on.
Are you gonna go get him?
Hell no, he's a regular.
Yeah,
he can
it's
bring
true.
himself
Alex,
in. Come on,
man.
down.
Come on, sit down on yourself. So, but full disclosure to the audience,
Let's go, man.
before we brought him on, he said that the walk-in process is awkward, and so we decided to make it even more awkward. So, hey, welcome, Alex. So, for you listeners out there, Alex McKenzie Johnson, Geosyntech, is here with us again. The Dirt Merchant returns. Return of the Dirt Merchant.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, Rhett and Chris, and it is awkward. You got to kind of walk up, pull out your chair, and sit down.
Nobody's
there's no
forcing you to do
smooth
this.
way to do it, right? Like,
There is.
You can come in and do smooth dance moves like Christopher and I do. I mean, you see
I
it.
think that would look
See,
even
the only
worse.
people who
coming
watch
from
the
me.
YouTube would know that, right?
Mhm.
Or they would see like the awkward, like when somebody wants to shake your hand and you don't meet them halfway, like all that stuff that happens. You would never see that if you don't watch the
I was
YouTube.
inspired by the Olympics. That's why I did the whole 360 thing.
Wh-
with you
why
right
why,
there.
why
That's
do you
what
think
that
I'm
was.
wearing the jersey?
I mean, really, really
Let's
well
go.
done.
Hey, USA has a lot of champions, and
So-
females seem to be leading the way.
Alex, this is the IPCE series, and we brought you on to talk about the IPCE 2022 publication, a deep dive into the use of LiDAR change detection analysis for regional landslide monitoring in the Appalachian Basin Region of the U.S. Besides that title being a mouthful, and I do understand, I just realized when we got here, you're not even an author on the paper. So I want to acknowledge to the audience, the authors of this paper, Bailey Thoreau, Christopher Markley, and Tara Metzger are the authors. You don't even get an honorable mention.
It's
But
kind of like
somehow-
it's kind of like your brother-in-law getting credit for your yard.
I mean, but you're going to talk about the paper, right?
Well, I mean, in fairness, I tried to offer up my paper that I wrote at IPCE 2022, and you guys weren't interested. You wanted to talk about this one.
What was the
Well,
name of it? I don't
also-
know if I remember it. What was it?
It's similar. It's got LiDAR. It's got landslides in it. But in fairness, we've got a great bunch of geologists at Geosyntech and do a lot of similar work. But we give a lot of opportunities for people to publish papers. And Bailey, Chris, and Terry do a great job. And I'm excited to talk about their work and the work that we do.
Did you at least review the paper?
I reviewed the paper.
Okay, so you're familiar enough with the paper to talk competently to the audience,
And I
right?
did get Bailey's permission to discuss the paper on this podcast, so this is something
And
she's aware of.
Let the record show we invited Bailey to do the podcast, and she deferred to Alex. So next time,
No, she turned us down.
Would she
There's-
be the-
yeah,
Yeah,
it's a shut you down.
and now that's
type
on record.
situation.
That's on
Yeah.
record.
I think she listened to a couple of your podcasts. And
She's going to
decided-
catch this one now.
Nah,
The
not gonna
dirt,
do
the
it.
dirt merchant tests decline. No, but in all serious, tell us a little bit if you don't mind. Actually, the audience already knows you, so we'll skip introductions.
Mhm.
For this guest, we will skip introductions.
Excellent.
But tell us a little bit about the paper if you don't mind. What was the genesis? What's the idea behind it? How did it find its way into IPCE 2022?
Sure. So, the overview of the paper is it's looking at how LiDAR is being increasingly used to identify new landslides, to monitor existing landslides and changes in these landslides. The particular paper is looking at application of about 1,400 pipeline miles in Appalachia, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, with the time span of the original LiDAR collection started in 2015, and then going up to shortly before the date of the publication of the paper. The importance of what it's really looking at, and as we're kind of talking about the podcast ahead of time, is it's showing how this technique of using LiDAR repeatedly, so repeatedly collecting LiDAR and analyzing the change, is increasingly becoming a tool in pipeline operators' toolbox to monitor geohazards and to identify new ones that form after a baseline assessment. So you kind of think of how the original uses of LiDAR for pipeline companies were to identify geohazards from some kind of baseline LiDAR. And then starting in the late 2010s, the pipeline operators started to realize, hey, you could do repeat LiDAR in the same areas, and you can very accurately identify changes to those landslides or new ones that have formed after the baseline.
So, you're describing actually a very similar trajectory that I felt like bending strain was on. So I remember in 2017, when I really started getting into bending strain data, I'd say amongst the large operators, you probably had maybe 30% of them that were doing bending strain the first time in 2017. And we had very few comparisons in 2017. I mean, it was probably 2% of all assessments we were doing. And then over a span of 5 to 6 years, I mean, you look at now, I feel like we probably have of the major operators north of 50% that are actively doing bending strains on at least a subset of their pipelines. And it's a much larger portion that are doing comparisons. But what drove the ability to do it in bending strain was regulatory, right? So if you had to go 5 or 7 years between an assessment, it meant that oftentimes you had to wait another 5 to 7 years to get that data set. Is that like a similar trend that you're seeing with LiDAR data here? Is it?
I think so. I think that, kind of going back to, I mean, it's kind of helpful to talk about the origin of LiDAR. Yeah. In terms of how we use it now. So the original LiDAR collection, kind of widespread areas, was started in the late 1990s with government agencies. And at the time, it's very expensive. It's very low resolution compared to the LiDAR that we have today. So you have much higher cost, much lower resolution. You can kind of think of it like, I don't know, like when you were a kid and you go over to like your rich friend's house. And the dad
I didn't have any rich friends.
Yeah. Well, imagine if and they bought like a 35 or 40 inch TV, right? And those
CRT projection,
giant TV, super expensive. But even then, it's still fuzzy, right? Like you're trying to watch football, and you can I think the ball's over there, or you're watching hockey. I don't know if you remember like when Fox started doing like the light up puck thing because the resolution is so low you couldn't actually see where the puck was. In those days,
nobody in Texas watched hockey.
Yeah. So you kind of fast forward over time, and when pipeline companies started to do geohazard programs and assessments, they're primarily using these public data sets, which at the time were pretty spotty in availability. Most places didn't have them, and also pretty low resolution. So you get a lot of false positives, false negatives from these kind of early uses of LiDAR, but it's still way better than what they had prior to the use of LiDAR. You fast forward to the 2010s, and when I was working at Kinder Morgan, we realized we were getting way too many false positives and false negatives from using the government data that was available at that time. And some places didn't have LiDAR at all. So we did an experiment. What would be the cost to get our own LiDAR and start to process it? And we instantly realized that this greatly improved the accuracy of our landslide identification. A little bit later, we said, what if we went back and did it again and then compared the two? And we didn't invent that process. So there were people who were already doing repeat LiDAR, but at pretty limited locations. And we found that that was a relatively straightforward process to compare one LiDAR data set to another. And it was very, very accurate. We were able to identify significant changes, including on pipeline right-of-ways from landslides and other geohazard type effects that like the aerial patrol or ground patrol had not picked up because these were happening under thick tree cover, which LiDAR is able to map into the ground surface.
So give or take ballpark, what percentage of operators would you say are actively using LiDAR now? Give me a lay of the landscape.
So one of the big developments that's happened since that time is the USGS, United States Geological Survey,
right,
has a program called the 3D Elevation Program. And they've been compiling public LiDAR across the U.S. and then areas that don't have existing LiDAR, they've been collecting new LiDAR. So I think last time I looked, they're up to about like 85-90% coverage of the U.S. And what that really is making an advantage now is for those pipeline companies that are just starting geohazard programs, they're able to go to this public data set that now is much higher resolution than used to be available, covers much more of the country, and they're able to use that for baseline mapping. So pretty much all pipeline companies now that are doing active geohazard programs are using LiDAR, either collecting their own or going to the public.
And what percentage of companies do you think that is? Just ballpark it for me. Just a guess.
It's a tough question because I think you have a number of companies, then you have a number.
Let the record say he refuses to answer. I've asked it twice. Chris, do you think he'll answer the question?
It's almost metallurgical if you think.
Hold
about
on,
it, right?
I was gonna say the 30%, is it 20%?
I know. It's like Dave Johnson said. The same thing applies for geologists, metallurgists. That's why you want one arm to geologist,
exactly.
right?
All right. Well, tie an arm behind your back and get you to make an answer.
But I was going to say, by pipeline mileage, it's a very high percentage. So you look at most of the big companies are looking at LiDAR. They have active geohazard programs. So I'm going to ballpark that and say probably 70-80% of the pipeline miles. But there's all these smaller companies that are in various states of maturity with their integrity programs, and I don't know how many.
Yeah, so 70 or 80 are doing first-time assessments, but I'm curious, how many of them are on repeat assessments? Where's the market on repeat assessments?
I would say it's much smaller because the repeat assessments, you have to collect it yourself. There is not a government agency that's doing repeat LiDAR.
Gotcha.
So that's where companies are having to decide where to do it, and what's the resolution, the frequency.
That's still a pretty big advantage, right? Because a lot of times, if you think of baseline assessments, like if you have a pretty decent sized network, it's where do I start?
Exactly.
Right. And so where do I put my initial dollars? Because you want that to be representative where you think you have the threat. So if the USGS is already giving you a ton of that baseline information where it gives you a lot of grounds to say, you know what, I can focus my resources in evaluating my baseline.
Could you imagine if the federal government had paid for all of the original inline inspections for the baseline assessments?
Can I imagine it?
Yeah.
I could probably imagine it, but we'd be in a very different spot. That's for sure.
Yeah, but that's the equivalent. I mean, it's really amazing that a data set that can be used to perform a baseline with some reasonable degree of accuracy is out there, right?
Yeah.
And that really just opens the door for operators to add on top of it.
So
honestly, sorry to interrupt, Chris.
No, go ahead.
It's a game changer, right? Because one of the big obstacles for a lot of companies to do geohazard programs was if you have 10,000 miles of pipeline and you're looking at collecting 10,000 miles of LiDAR and you don't already have that as part of your budget and it's not required by regulation, it's really hard to find the money for that. But it's a lot easier to go to the USGS and say, I'm going to pay a geologist to review this data and find ideally those few hotspots where I need to really focus my future assessment efforts on.
So you mentioned change analysis, right? And so, it's fair to say a lot of our audience is probably pretty comfortable with ILI data and maybe less comfortable with LiDAR data. So give us a comparison, right? So for us, when we look at ILI data, we do a comparison. A lot of times you can have different ILI companies that provide the data, and we have processes for comparing them. It's usually not the full line. You're not going to inspect all 30 miles signal to signal. We have alternate processes. We're really focusing, like you said, on hotspots, right? Where places where we know, and then we can pull up the data on both, compare them and say, hey, I think I compare this data set to that and draw a conclusion. We normally look for things like evidence of change. That can be done by one of the vendors or a consultant. What does it look like if an operator is trying to do a strain change, right? Is that a specific consultancy? Is that the LiDAR companies themselves? Is it something that takes 6 months? Is it a day? Give us, the quick and dirty on it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Now, one of the things that's really nice about LiDAR data, if both data sets are collected with high quality data and they're using proper survey control, you're pretty much agnostic in terms of the source, right? And there's two basic ways you can do the change. The simplest and easiest method is you output the results of the LiDAR survey in what's called a digital elevation model. So you can think of this basically as a very fine grid where each cell is assigned an elevation. And so in essence, you're just laying over one grid over the other and you're subtracting out the difference, right? And so then your resultant grid is showing the differences between the two. And you can use that to visualize, or you can use it to screen out various things to identify where these changes are happening. A little more complicated process is taking the point cloud itself. So you think of the original LiDAR data, it's getting all these points. And you just collect the differences in points between the two surveys.
So these processes are pretty good at aligning them, right? So for example, in ILI data, a lot of times we'll align by girth weld. So we have something fixed. But if you have all these points, you guys, it's not as complicated. There's established processes for doing point to point.
As long as the original data collection is good, it's very straightforward. In fact, it's almost, you can think of you get these DEMs within minutes, even seconds sometimes. You can tell your GIS system to do at least a rough output from that. Wow. So it's a basic GIS process. It's kind of almost magical that here's this thing that's processing that much data. It can do it so quickly, and in most cases, it's pretty accurate. Now, you might want to do other things to align the data a little bit better, to smooth it or clean it,
Yeah.
which might take a little bit more time. But the basic idea is it's an
So
inherent
big
change
difference
process.
here, right? I mean, for us to do a run comparison on ILI, normally it's a couple of weeks, right? Just the whole process. I heard you say a couple of seconds to minutes here.
Now that's
And
to
it-
get
and-
the
and-
raw outputs. That's getting the grid. Now the harder part is going through what does it mean, right?
Sure.
And it's a lot like what you guys do with bending strain, right?
Yep.
Anybody can do a bending strain
Calculation. Yes.
But what does it mean, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the analysis comes into it, because you're going to get change all over the place.
Yeah.
You can see things. It's so sensitive. You can see things like anomaly digs where
Where they change the soil.
yeah, you can see the slight difference in elevation between
Yeah.
before and after they did the anomaly dig, even though to the people on the site, it's going to look like they put it back to the same
Yeah, of course.
elevation, right?
Makes sense.
You can see where people are building houses. You can see where streams are changing position, and you can see things like landslides.
But now that's a person, what you're saying, right? So once you have the elevation change results, you now need a human presently to go in and identify these locations of change.
That's right. And I know there's probably a lot of the audience is thinking, okay, what about AI or machine
Of course,
learning?
of
And of
course.
course, there's hot topics, and people are looking into
Yeah,
that.
I just want to drag and drop.
Yeah.
And then it I have boxes that it tells me where to go look.
Right. But you can think of it like, you're very familiar, obviously, with ILI processes, right? Even with things to automate and speed up the process, you always need that human analyst component.
You want to
go
leverage
through.
experience. That's the
not-
idea.
I'm going to guess it's probably similar to bending strain.
Yeah.
It'll catch something like 75% of the features, but then it's that 25% pull that usually lie on the extremes. It's either something you really should be concerned about or it's totally benign.
Yeah.
And it's like that's where the computer has trouble categorizing that correctly, and the consequences are usually most significant for it.
Right. And I guess the other big challenge with this is, you're looking at LiDAR data sets, you're looking at 3 dimensions, right? And you're looking at ILI, you're looking in 2 dimensions, right? So you have to have not just the right of way of the pipeline, but you have to look all this area around it. So, to a computer, a lot of things are going to look pretty similar. But there's going to be some kind of change that's happening. So you do need that. Is the change I'm seeing, is that because someone built a house? Or is that because there's a landslide?
Sure.
Is that because somebody over here is digging some dirt out to put someplace else?
Yeah, I mean, the advantage, obviously, we're kind of going on, I feel like, a tangent of it, but the idea there is
It was your tangent.
these automated systems allow you to use your time efficiently, right?
That's
so
right.
if you can create the margins, now you focus on the
So-
margins.
We're going to take a break real quick. When we come back, audience, I want to get into what you get from the differencing, because Alex talked about that, but I want to talk a little bit about maybe the difference between horizontal and vertical, and also maybe some of, if you're interested, what you would get from this type of assessment. So come back right from the break. So, all right, welcome back to Pipeline Things. We're in the middle of our discussion on the IPCE 2022 paper that the Dirt Merchant did not author, nor was he mentioned in the credits, but apparently was cited, but is yet competent to discuss the matter. I can't get over it. So, but we're having fun at your expense, Alex. It's a wonder you came back on the podcast. It is a real wonder. Why did you come back?
I guess I'm just a glutton for punishment.
Well, we enjoy having you. So we're glad you accepted.
People say so many nice things about me all the time. Once in a while, it's kind of nice to kind of have that ego kind of taken down.
It kind of makes you wonder why Bailey didn't show up, right? Maybe she knows something.
She probably watched
You know?
it. She's like, "There's no way I'm going on with those idiots." So hey, going back, you talked about how, and I appreciate you talked about how the actual LiDAR differencing works, right?
Yep.
So in the concept of a digital elevation model, and for those who are not on the YouTube channel, I'm sorry, right? If I had 2 planes of paper like this and they're digital elevation models, if it goes straight down, the measure of vertical difference is easy to see. But if one plane slides perfectly relative to the other, how does the digital elevation model or changes in the DEM work in that case? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point, Brett, because you're right. At an individual location, you're showing a vertical change, right? But it's the aggregate of change that you're seeing. And so you think of a landslide, it's got to drop down at the head. So like you've got this downward movement, and then at the toe, you've got an upward movement, right? And so from the identification or recognition of the movement, that's one of the signatures you're looking for. You're looking for this decrease in elevation and then an increase in elevation someplace else. You can also think of, because the LiDAR is so sensitive, right? You can see where this displacement is happening. So you can see, like, the landslide is moving. You can see it was here, and now it's, again, apologies for those who aren't on the video, but you can see it then lengthening and moving down slope, right? So you can see now, the toe was here, now it's further down the slope. And so you can measure that change that happens as the landslide is moving. You can also, because you know what the slope is, you can use that to deduce the horizontal movement from the vertical movement, right? Okay. So you can measure the slope of them.
So rather than explicitly measuring, you can kind of estimate a horizontal movement.
Yeah, and that being said, if you're doing the point-to-point measurement, so we talked about there's the two methods, right? There's the DEM method, which is the most common method of doing the change detection. The other one's the point-to-point. You can directly measure the horizontal change that happens.
So cool. So you talked about landslides. I assume landslides are a given thing that you could find in doing this type of assessment. I mean, what other things are you seeing when you're doing digital elevation model comparisons or repeat LiDAR assessments? Do we have a cool name for it? Are we just calling it repeat LiDAR?
You should call it differential LiDAR or
differential LiDAR.
Change detection.
DIFDAR.
Yeah, there you go. I like
DIFDAR. Sounds like
that sounds kind of very like
that sounds like
futuristic sci-fi.
Or something like that.
Are you doing your annual DIFDAR? So what kind of things are you seeing out there that we're...
I mean, I have always been a geohazard guy, a geologist guy, but during my time at Kinder Morgan, I also really advocated for the use of LiDAR for other parts of pipeline management, right? Because you can see things like third-party encroachments. You can see construction happening. You can see...
third-party excavations in a shared right-of-way?
Yes. Yep. So you can see, anything that's resulting in an elevation change around the pipeline, around the right-of-way, is going to show up in that differential LiDAR. And so you can think of a lot of different applications for it. I know we're not talking about it now, but you can even, using the base LiDAR data, you can see things like vegetation encroachment, where trees and things growing over the top of the pipelines are too close to the pipelines. So there's a lot of uses that pipeline companies can put the LiDAR to. It's just, I think it's kind of limited by the imagination and the availability of resources.
Can you talk about the most shocking thing you ever saw?
Most shocking thing I ever saw?
Most surprising, shocking? Caught you off guard with that one.
You did catch me a little off guard, except, I think one of the most interesting things that's kind of hard to describe is seeing what's basically a whole hillside moving with a differential LiDAR that didn't really show up in the original assessment. So we had gullies.
Original assessment. You mean with the original LiDAR or like
the original LiDAR? We're mapping this out. Didn't see and then when you see this repeat LiDAR, you see this entire hillside, very large hillside, moving in a way that probably wasn't even visible on the ground, but you can see it, clearly between these two images. So, like I said, it's really, really sensitive. I would say it's more sensitive than a good geologist being able to pick up these changes in movements.
So, if we have differential LiDAR and AI on one side, and we have the dirt merchant and a right-of-way plane on the other, which one wins?
The LiDAR every time.
Wow.
Yeah.
There you go. I'm being a facetious example, but what you're indicating to me is that the use of this would be vastly superior to any form of visual inspection, you think?
At least for these big areas where you're looking at, tens, hundreds, thousands of miles of pipeline right-of-way. So, early in my career, I used to do a lot of helicopter reconnaissance, a lot of helicopter flights. Super fun. It's awesome to be flying around in a helicopter for...
But dollar for dollar,
LiDAR is vastly superior.
Wow.
And, you think of if we're out here, look out the window and you see all these trees in the background, a lot of pipeline right-of-ways look like that. You're trying to look down from a helicopter. You're flying 70, 80 miles per hour, which is not terribly fast. But you've got to look down through these trees, and you've got to be able to see some kind of landslide with all this tree cover over the top. You're going to miss almost everything, unless it's really, really big. And if it's really, really big, somebody probably would already know about it. So LiDAR is vastly superior to aerial patrol, even by trained geologists.
So one of the things that come to mind, and we talked about this, I actually think it was the episode that we shot in my truck. That was a fun one. Mm-hmm. We had this discussion around monitoring and assessment. So I want to resurrect that. So when we think of what you're just describing, of one, you do a baseline analysis, I'll use, not assessment. Let's call it analysis for now. You're identifying where there's change. This simple, can you use LiDAR as an assessment? Right? Because when we think of assessment, we think pass or fail, right? So the impact of the change happening on the pipeline. To what extent can we use LiDAR as an assessment, in your opinion?
I think you can use it as part of the the overall assessment. We've talked a lot
Yep.
in these podcasts and
Yep.
other venues about the importance of having multiple sources of information, particularly for geohazards.
Yep.
Ideally, you've got LiDAR and you've got IMU bending strain.
Yeah.
If it's a really critical site, maybe you have strain gauges and inclinometers and other pieces of information. But when you're looking at this differential LiDAR, you're looking at things that are way away from the pipeline. So you can see, hey, there's a landslide that's forming or enlarging, but it's way away from the pipeline. And so you can look at that and say, we've identified it, it's in the system, we're watching it, we don't need to do anything more about that. So you've already done your kind of pass-fail for that feature. Now, it gets a little more complicated if you see, hey, this change is happening right over the top of the pipeline.
Sure.
Then, ideally, you're bringing in other pieces of data, and maybe then you are doing a field assessment to say, okay, let's kind of ground truth this and see what does this really look like on the ground. Can we figure out depth of cover? If we don't have good depth of cover information, how deep is the pipeline in that area? Do we have other information that's going to help us decide whether or not this is a really...
Yeah, so this is real big on susceptibility. Keywords here are susceptibility, monitoring, alerts, flagging, all of these things that say, hey, this needs attention.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you kind of think of a typical kind of progression, so step one, you've got some kind of change.
Yep.
Step two, what is it? Okay, so you think, okay, it's a change, but it's just somebody building a house next to the right-of-way, not a big deal.
Sure.
Or it's okay, it's a landslide near the right-of-way, but it's a long ways away. Okay, we're gonna mark it down, we're gonna record it, we're not going to do anything else about it. You think, okay, hey, you got a landslide, it's on the right of way. Let's trigger field assessment. Let's start bringing in other data sources. And that's where, the real advantage of that is that rather than having kind of indiscriminate analysis of pipeline right of ways for geohazards, you're able to target that location. You're able to send somebody right there to that spot. Yeah. You already know there's something happening there.
Pinpoint.
And they can kind of get the information you need to make that decision, whether or not this is something you have to do something more serious about.
Makes sense.
With all of the value, I mean, you propose literally if you have to choose between putting people in aerial patrol or repeat LiDAR. Repeat LiDAR is superior. What holds operators back from widespread adoption of this?
I think a couple things. We talked about it's a pretty new technology in terms of LiDAR itself is not new, right? And we, in our Clarion webinar, we talked about it.
Yep.
It goes back to the 1960s. A lot of cars and other systems use it. The basic technology is not new, but the use for pipeline applications is pretty new. And at least in the U.S., the earliest use I'm really aware of is the late 2010s. So you think of like 2018, 2019.
So we're only a decade old. I mean, that's fair.
I mean, less than a decade old, right? Mm-hmm. And so you think of like kind of how pipeline company budgets are built. There's a basis. The top priority is what are things that are compliance based, what's required by regulation. And then you go down to things that they've been doing that are kind of baseline costs, right? And so there's a strong incentive to, like, if you've been doing something, continue doing that. So it's kind of a fixed cost. People are comfortable with it. LiDAR being relatively new hasn't really worked its way into that. Yeah. That being said, more and more companies are adopting it, and they are, they're seeing the value out of it. I think what the key things that are helping out, one is that kind of like the TV example, right? You think of like how expensive a flat screen TV was when they first came out, and then how cheap they are now, and how high quality the images you can get. LiDAR, like a lot of technologies, is going through that same curve where you're getting higher and higher quality, lower and lower cost. The cost is becoming more bearable. The other part, I think, that's going to really kick it over, just kind of like we're talking about, if departments outside of just the geohazard departments
begin to
start to use it for other purposes, and the cost then becomes more distributed between these companies, I really think its use would
and maybe not even cost, but at least advantage, right? So I mean, we've seen that a lot with ILI data, right? Where you'll see once the data's in the GIS database, it's like, how can we use it, right? Clearly, LiDAR seems to have a similar path.
Excellent.
Yeah, and it's think of like when ILI. I mean, we're all probably too young to be familiar with when ILI started being adopted by pipeline companies. At the time, it was a big extra expense, and at some point, the thought of spending several $100,000 or even $1 million for an ILI run started to become accepted by these companies. And so you can think of LiDAR as probably on a similar path as people who are kind of growing up with it, move into positions of authority.
It's also
it starts to become a more accepted cost.
Yeah, it's also the regulatory component, right? I mean, you mentioned it, right? There's things that are compliance based, and we are where we are because of some of our prescriptive regulation. And so it's one thing to say, well, some would argue it's already prescriptive, right? Is if you have the threat, or if you don't know you have the threat, you need to go get the data.
But for our public utility companies and those that serve the public utility companies, man, it's almost like, I'm going to say it out loud, and I can't believe I'm saying this. I wish you had a publicly funded gathering of the LiDAR across the United States. I'm thinking of all the uses, right? Not only for pipelines, right? You could use it for electrical transmission systems to monitor vegetation growth on the right of way. There's all sorts of stuff you could, if you were gathering this. Literally, it has significant.
And there's different ways to make that happen, right? Trade organizations can do that, or voluntary information systems. Yeah. There's different ways to try to make that manifest.
So as we wrap up the show, Alex, what's in store for 2024? Is our audience going to find you at IPCE 2024?
I will be at IPCE 2024.
Do you have a publication?
I do have a publication, yes.
Will you be claiming...
You're a co-author on that publication.
The question is, will Rhett be claiming?
Yeah, so we'll host myself on the podcast next time. At least I can say I was on the publication. So excellent. We look forward to seeing you back at IPCE 2024. Any closing thoughts on LiDAR before we let you go?
No, first off, I always appreciate coming on the podcast. It's a great time.
You don't have to thank us. It's okay.
You guys do a great job. It's very entertaining. But I think, we've had a good conversation. What I encourage our listeners, if you're not already doing baseline geohazard assessments, and kind of give a credit to the government, right? The USGS's 3DEP program is a really great use of how our public dollars can provide a public and private benefit, and it's really been very successful. So for a lot of those companies who are kind of thinking about it but are kind of afraid of the cost, this is a thing that can really help them to better understand where they might have exposure to geohazards. In terms of the repeat LiDAR, I agree with everything you're saying. It would be awesome if there was a means to pool some of those resources. I know that a lot of pipeline companies are talking about it, but there are kind of structural liability barriers that make those things kind of hard to achieve.
Well, hopefully we find a way to overcome that.
A comment to the audience, it's often sometimes you'll find yourself in a rut, maybe not a rut, but just in the routine of work. And one of the reasons why we like bringing on the Dirt Merchant and different technologies on the podcast to give you guys some exposure to that, right? And if you're an integrity engineer or an integrity specialist and you're responsible for assets, the idea of some of these topics for you guys to raise your hand and ask questions, right? Like go to your GIS department and ask them about digital elevation models, call the Dirt Merchant, phone him up and say, hey, how do I get access to this? And plug them in with your GIS and start exploring, have some fun with it. Talk to your director and say, hey, we know we have this one project where we're really struggling with this. If there's this information, if you hear it here, hopefully that energizes you a little bit and gets you to activate and go have some fun with it. And if you do, let us know. Let us know how it goes. If you get, turned down or if it ends up turning to something really cool, we'd love to get some feedback.
Absolutely. All right. Well, hey, Chris, Alex, that's going to wrap us up. To our audience, thank you for joining us and stick around. We'll be back in 2 weeks and thanks. Catch you later. This episode of Pipeline Things is sponsored by D2 Integrity. The episode was produced by our executive producer, Sarah Roberts from ADV Marketing. Thank you to Alex McKenzie Johnson, the Dirt Merchant, for appearing as a guest, and to GeoSyntech Consultants for letting us use their office for filming. Signing off. See you next time.